We have our two main speakers, David A. Love and Professor Suhas Palshikar. This talk will be chaired by Vinod Mobile, and it will be moderated by Irfan Engineer. So I welcome the whole panel, but let me just begin by introducing our speakers, David A. Love, who is a journalist and a commentator who writes investigative stories and operates on a variety of issues, including politics, social justice, human rights, race, criminal justice, and inequality. Love's work has appeared in Al Jazeera, CNN, Atlanta Black Star, The Guardian, HuffPost, NBC News, EcoWood, The Progressive and BlackCommentator.com. In addition, he has been quoted by leading newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. He is a member of the editorial collective of Global African Workers and also an adjunct instructor at the Rutgers School of Communication and Information. He has contributed to a number of books such as States of Confinement, Policing, Detention and Prisons at the Tea Party, and Current Controversies, the Death Penalty. With this, I welcome David A. Love. It's our pleasure to have you today. The second speaker we have is Suhas Palshikar. Professor Suhas Palshikar is a known name internationally and in India. He's the co-director at Lokniti, a research program at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, and the chief editor of the journal Studies in Indian Politics. He was professor at Savitribai Phule Pune University till his retirement in 2016. His areas of specialization are political process in India, politics of Maharashtra, and political sociology of democracy. He has authored and co-edited many books and articles, including his more recent work reading India's Selection of Economic and Political Weekly, Indian Democracy and Electoral Politics in Indian States, Resurgence of Bharatiya Janata Party. He is also co-editor of SAGE series on politics in Indian states since 1990s. He's also a frequent contributor to EPW and Indian Express. I welcome Professor Suhas Palshikar. Today's chair is Vinod Mobile. Vinod Mobile is a patron of Center for Study of Society and Secularism and editor of INSAF, that is International South Asia Forum Bulletin. He was associated for many years with progressive movements in India, such as the Left Movement, Adivasi Movement, and Movement for Communal Harmony in India. He worked for many years with Dr. Asghar Ali, engineer, and he was a dear friend of his. He has settled for several years now in the US and worked there as a scientist. Vinod Mobile, I welcome you. And this session will be moderated by Irfan Engineer, who is the director of the Center for Study of Society and Secularism. So I welcome the whole panel, and I hand over the session now to Mr. Irfan Engineer.
Thank you very much, Neha, for introducing us, the panelists today, the chair. And with this, and without much ado, I would request Mr. David A. Love to make his opening remarks. What we'll do is, if that is acceptable to all, we'll have 10 minutes opening remark by both the panelists, 10 minutes each. After that, this will be followed by conversation with us, that is the chair and the moderator, with both the panelists. And then we'll open it up for everybody to ask their questions, and we can have a question and answer session but through chat box. Unfortunately, it might become noisy if everybody asks question at the same time. So chat box is a better option. All that you write in the chat box will be read out to the panelists for their responses. This is also being live streamed Facebook, the CSS page, and this will be recorded. So with this, I invite Mr. David A. Love to make his opening statement.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be here with you, particularly at this moment in time. I think this is a very crucial issue that we're discussing here. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Black Lives Matter movement and what has been happening over the past several years, but particularly what has been taking place in the past several months. So the Black Lives Matter movement is only 7 years old. And in that period of time, it has become what I believe is the foremost social justice movement in the United States. So what started in 2013 as a hashtag in response to the murder of a Black teen, Trayvon Martin, by a vigilante, has evolved into a national and an international force seeking to eliminate racism, systemic racism, and to dismantle oppressive institutions. So Black Lives Matter is a campaign against police abuse, brutality, racial abuses, and human violations in the criminal justice system. But the dynamics of the movement, I believe, have changed this year. In 2020, with George Floyd and the convergence of events that have created somewhat of a national multiracial rebellion, a mini revolution, if you will. So obviously police brutality is by no means a new phenomenon in the United States. It dates back to the times of slavery, when armed white men patrolled the slave plantations and had the power to capture and kill Black people. In the 1960s, figures such as Malcolm X, groups such as the Black Panthers fought against police violence. And in the 1990s, as a human rights activist, I worked with victims of police violence and organized the first police brutality conference in the United States. So countless number of people, thousands upon thousands of people of color have been murdered by police over the years. But the May 25th strangulation murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, I believe will prove to be a pivotal moment in the country's history. So the question is, what made this time different? George Floyd was not the first victim, nor will he be the last, unfortunately. And yet his death became a catalyst for potentially historic change because of the timing and the circumstances. For one, the murder was recorded on video at a time of viral social media where things can spread like wildfire. The incident took place in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, which is itself an event of historic proportions, with millions of Americans infected, over 120,000 dead, and millions of people unemployed during an economic collapse the country has not witnessed in nearly a century. So with millions of people in quarantine, on lockdown, while millions of others have been forced to risk their health and their lives to go out and work. Everyone is living in a time of uncertainty, fear, and trauma. And people have had the time to actually reflect, to think about their lives, to think about the problems in society. And the coronavirus has exposed the inherent injustices, the contradictions, the moral blind spots in the US, the so-called land of the free, staggering and worsening economic inequality, racism, that the country never really came to terms with, born from the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of African people. We never really know how revolutions or rebellions will come about. I believe George Floyd would not have become a transformative moment without the pandemic. George Floyd himself had survived illness from the coronavirus weeks earlier, only to meet his death from the knee of a police officer on his neck. People living under a neo-fascist government under Donald Trump have reached the breaking point as people are dying from the coronavirus, disproportionately Black, brown, poor, and working people, through the policies of a white supremacist government led by incompetent and greedy sociopaths who will send lambs to the slaughter for the sake of economic growth. Trump, I take it, is a fellow traveler with your Prime Minister, Modi, like-minded individuals. I believe that this moment in time is very American, but also very international. So the George Floyd murder and the aftermath has become a reckoning. The U.S. is now coming to terms with its civil war, which was fought 155 years ago, but was never really resolved. Racism and white supremacy, which have been a daily reality for people of color for centuries, have now taken center stage in the public discourse. Protests are taking place throughout the country that the scale of which have not been seen since the 1960s. And today's protests eclipse the movements of the past. America is having an awakening where white people are now realizing the need for change. A majority of the US population now supports Black Lives Matter, according to polls. And Black Lives Matter protests are taking place even in predominantly white parts of the country, in small towns and rural areas, not just cities. And these protests are leading to change. So on the federal, the state, and city level, policing reforms are being proposed. People are calling for the dismantling and defunding of law enforcement agencies, diversion of resources from weapons of war to programs of social uplift and wealth redistribution. And now violent police officers are facing termination and even prosecution for their abuse. The issue of reparations for slavery is now a serious issue in the national discourse. Symbols of white supremacy are being dismantled as the country proceeds with a cultural shift. Statues of slave masters, colonizers, white supremacists are being toppled, whether by protesters or through government edict. Colleges and universities named for racist US presidents and other leaders are now being renamed. So this is a national conversation, not just on police violence, but on the daily affronts also that Black and brown people experience with racism in school, at work, their daily lives, the so-called microaggressions that we face, daily indignities, traumatic and humiliating experiences. And on the world stage, George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement resonate with people in the global community. BLM demonstrations are being held all over the world, representing international solidarity with African Americans. So you're seeing demonstrations and protests in London, in Paris, in Germany, Australia, New Zealand. But in addition to that, you're also seeing calls for freedom and racial justice within those countries. So that's why Black people, people of African descent in Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, people in West Papua who are suffering oppression at the hands of the Indonesian government. All of these people are saying Black Lives Matter, but they're also talking about themselves and what they're facing. And I should also add that all of this is taking place as the US experiences a seismic demographic shift. It is a hopeful time and a potentially productive moment in the country. If it so chooses, the US can heal itself and become an anti-racist society. A majority of the children born in America right now are Black and brown. So they look like my children. And this reality poses an existential threat to the right wing, to Trump and his supporters. So I believe that white reactionaries will continue to rail against the browning of America and do whatever they can to maintain white power and white supremacy, whether through voter suppression, detention of immigrants in camps, physical violence, or through armed right-wing groups waging violence, and even genocide. And lastly, I'll say that the upcoming presidential election is the most important election, perhaps in the nation's history, because it will determine whether the US will become a true progressive multiracial democracy where Black and brown people are regarded as human beings, or we will sink deeper into authoritarianism, corruption, and white supremacy. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I believe that Black Lives Matter is shaping this election and the political landscape, and is calling for an American transformation. History has shown that progress does not take place in a straight line, but rather through advancements followed by regression. And there is much time for things to get worse before they get better, but I do think they will get better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. David, for your very erudite presentation, very forthright, without mincing words, very strong words, and welcome that they were so forthright. You call this movement as a mini revolution, and it's not just about George Floyd, but the names, the heritage of white racist heritage, the white supremacist heritage is being questioned in universities and colleges and education institutions. And it's not only about police brutality, as you rightly brought out. It's about microaggression in daily lives that people are, especially Black and brown people, are facing in the insults, the everything, the discrimination, intolerance, that, and the connection that you made between the oppression of the Blacks in US and colored people, as well as the oppression of all people in the world, the others, minorities, whether racial minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, national minorities. You made those connections. And you explained why why with George Floyd, this movement is becoming so widespread. The video, the COVID situation under lockdown, the time people have to think about all these things. And I must say, breaking lockdown rules, people came on the streets, thought this was more important than dying with corona. I believe New York Times says that there were demonstrations in more than 2,000 cities in US. That's what New York Times says. So this is the, thank you for bringing all that out. And with this, I would request Professor Palshikar to make his opening remarks. And followed by, we could have conversation with Mr. David as well as Professor Palshikar, the chair, as well as we could have a conversation.
Thank you, Irfan, and thank you, CSSS, for hosting this very important discussion this evening here, this morning, the other part of the world. Listening to Mr. David, I was wondering how I should be responding to the situation and the points that he has made, because I was not sure about our own situation in the country, and whether we could respond to it with the cautious optimism that he expressed. Probably we would be, as I would conclude, we would be forced to say that in the Indian context at least, the caution would be not to be optimistic and to be more realistic about not to be optimistic. But I shall come to that a bit later. Since we began this discussion with the question of race and color, though in India there are many other dimensions to whose lives really matter in India, we must at the same time preface this discussion and my remarks with the fact that many Caribbean cricket players recently have come out with stories how they were being harassed when they were playing in India or other parts of the world because of the color of their skin. And for us in India, it's a very ironical situation, because one would have thought historically that the question of race and color is white man's burden. But in India, we seem to have borrowed that burden ourselves, and in a sense, borrowed along with it the idea that color matters. It is in the year 2020, therefore, and after all this discussion that has been going on globally, that a corporate and its branches in India, Hindustan Lever, only this week or last week, so to say, announced that they would rebrand one of their products, which is known as Fair and Lovely, which is a product which claims that it makes not only women but men also fair. And it's not just one corporate going with impunity to talk about the question of color. The question is rather broader, which is that most of our entertainment industry heroes and heroines don't find anything wrong in commercializing that product. So it is this larger atmosphere, perhaps of an ingrained and deep-rooted idea of discrimination, that we need to discriminate someone, that informs our social being. But having said that, let me come to the question, whose lives matter in India? In principle, of course, one would say that all lives should matter, but the fact is, all lives don't matter. And once you start answering this question in the Indian context, things become much more complicated, because many lives don't matter in India in terms of communities. And I shall come to the most sensitive issue later, but some of us here listening to this panel must be aware that some years ago there was some discussion of the conceptual and empirical overlap between race and caste. Caste, which is an Indian institution, typically was seen as having some commonalities and overlaps with the race, and therefore the community, which was historically treated as untouchable in the Indian context, which are now officially designated as the scheduled castes, are seen to be a community which is generally discriminated, although by law and by Constitution of India, untouchability is something which is an offense, which cannot be practiced. Even then, whether it is police brutalities, as David was talking about, whether it is the number of accused persons against whom cases are pending and those who are in jail without bail. You come to any other criteria and you will find that it is this community which is at the receiving end both of social ostracization, indignity, and systemic unfairness. And therefore, in the Indian context, the moment one talks of Black Lives Matter, probably the best way of resonating that sentiment would be to talk of this very deep-rooted historical injustice that the Indian society has been meting out to the scheduled castes that constitute more than 10% in the Indian context, in fact, much more than 10%. Then you come across the various inhabitants of our forests, again in the Indian context, the tribals, who are not only robbed of dignity, but robbed of their resources consistently by the state of India. And therefore, you have this other systemic unfairness that you have to face. Third, which is more awkward, is the community living in the northeastern parts of India, which has different racial features from the majority of the people in the rest of India, and therefore sometimes they are also ostracized, indignities are hurled at them. So it's not just the ex-untouchable scheduled caste community, but many other communities that might also be actually willing to participate, should be willing to participate in this movement like the Black Lives Matter movement. But more contemporarily, and what our regime currently targets much more, is the question of religious minorities and therefore targeting of the Muslim community in particular. So while conceptually one can find some resonance between the situation of the untouchables or ex-untouchables, the scheduled castes, and the question of race, in the Indian context, the real problem begins when one starts talking about the Muslims, a religious minority of India, an important religious minority of India, but a minority nonetheless. Now, here you will find that there are complications. The moment you start off talking of the Muslims, one goes into history. And this history, unlike the history of racial discrimination, is not a very old or ancient history. It is the history of colonialism, during which the two communities, the majority and the minority communities, started suspecting each other. That's one. The second part of this is the unfortunate wound of partition of the Indian subcontinent under the British rule in 1947, for which those Muslims who now live in India are generally suspected to be responsible, accused to be responsible. Now let's not go into that debate about who was responsible for the partition, but the point that therefore today's Muslims who are citizens of India are suspected, their nationalism and their patriotism is suspected, is cause for discrimination against them. And then on top of it, you have a series of violence events, incidents, pogroms, riots between the Hindus and the Muslims, one after the other. Almost every 10 years, there is a cycle of vicious violence against the minorities, sometimes in the form of riots, sometimes in the form of pogroms. Now, why do I bring the Muslim question? There is a reason for that, which is that only just before the pandemic broke down in India, and the lockdown came, politics had actually become very hot in India, mainly on the question of an amendment to India's Citizenship Act, which this present government has done, which apparently doesn't talk of Muslims. But just because it doesn't talk of Muslims, it was seen as discriminatory against Muslims, coupled with the exercise that the government was expected to start a couple of months ago, known as the National Population Register. The official moves of the government were seen as targeting the Muslim community in particular. So on the one hand, you have social prejudices against a large minority of the country. On the other hand, you have inbuilt systemic unfairness and discrimination of the community. So the question then arises, how can a community respond to this situation? Taking a cue from the Black Lives Matter movement, one would have imagined three things at least. One is that the society as such accepts that the victims have the right to protest. The victims, in the second place, assert themselves, protest, and assert their citizenship rights. And the third is the non-victims align, at least a critical mass of the non-victims aligns with the victims and gets scandalized. And I would like to actually pinpoint this third thing, which is that in India, the non-victims rarely get scandalized by discrimination against the victim community. And this is true of all the communities that I mentioned. It's just not true only about the Muslims. It's equally true of the ex-untouchable scheduled castes of today. It is equally true of the Adivasis. So the question is, why does this happen? To my mind, one of the reasons why this happens is because of the way we construct community in the Indian context. We don't see the community, we don't see the civil society beyond our limited ideas of who belongs to my group, my race, my caste, my religion, my region, and so on. It is this fragmented nature of the community that we encounter in India, which might be the root cause as to why this happens in the Indian context. In other words, therefore, and that is why the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act agitation becomes important, that agitation, starting from December 2019 to 2020 February, when finally the pandemic actually broke it down, two things were happening for the first time perhaps. The first was, on a sustained basis, the Muslim community was protesting peacefully mostly against what they believed was discrimination against them. But more importantly and secondly, slowly, a slightly larger mass of non-Muslims was aligning with the Muslims on these questions of discrimination. But the fragmented nature of the Indian idea of community means that there is, instead of unity of different victim communities, there is probably a diffusion of victim communities. Let me then come to the last part really, which is that in this context of discrimination and in this context that we don't get scandalized, why did I say that perhaps in India it might be tough for us to share the optimism which David was pointing out? Probably three things are happening that make us less optimist and more of a cautious pessimist, if I will put it that way. The first is, as I said, the multiple fault lines mean that structurally in India, we are unable to build a kind of front, a kind of social coalition, either of the victims or the victims and the non-victims. So it is this multiple fault lines, which is one thing. The second thing, which is more contemporary, because multiple fault lines is not something that has happened in 2019 or 2020. That's been there historically. In fact, the Indian nation was built on this idea of diversity and therefore multiple groups coming together, fighting it out, etc. What happens, for example, when the systemic rhetoric privileges a certain idea of nation? That is what is happening in India, that the systemic rhetoric privileges a certain idea of nation, and it is this privileging of the idea of nation not just over other ideas of inclusive nation, but also over democracy. So the prevalent official discourse in India has this normative ordering in which the nation comes above, and probably democracy and therefore the right to protest, etc., can be sacrificed at the altar of this idea of nation. That's the second thing which is happening more blatantly past 5-6 years. But let us be clear that it has been happening over past couple of decades actually. So what is happening here in India in 2020 is not an accident, is not a catastrophe only brought out by a leader, but which was building up and we couldn't stop it from happening. And then the third thing, which this regime has brought about on ourselves, which is that there is a complete reconstruction of words, of ideas, of norms. Nation is something all of us have always been proud of, but suddenly the meaning of nation has been reconstructed. Fairness, all of us would always say, yes, fairness is one of the pillars of democracy, but that fairness has as a term and as an operational idea has been redefined. And the same applies to democracy. Democracy in the Indian context increasingly means that if the larger group, the majority community believes in certain norms, then those norms should govern. It is this reversal, redefinition, and narrowing of various ideas and the universe of ideas that makes us not get scandalized. So it's not just the cozy middle class which sits in its drawing rooms which doesn't get scandalized, but in many cases even the victims don't easily get scandalized. And it is this moment of some kind of a stagnation in the idea of democracy which has been brought about by a confluence of majoritarian community idea and a populist leadership that probably informs our present predicament. So I hope David will forgive me for not agreeing with him on the question of optimism, at least in the Indian context, but he will also appreciate the predicament that Democrats in India are currently facing on questions such as why certain lives don't matter. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor Palshikar. Building on your article that you had written on 11th June in Indian Express, will there be George Floyd moment in India's public life? Where you listed some of your arguments you presented now, but you built even further and went into, I was thinking that one component missing in the article was why civil society, why the society is not reacting to, and you explicated all those things here, how Indian society is not fragmented, and Babasaheb Ambedkar called it segregated inequality. So there is a hierarchy of inequality. There are not just four varnas, but many castes within each varna, and people feel that somebody is above me, but somebody is below me, and has some stake in that. So the fragmented nation, the victim community, Northeast, Muslims, scheduled caste, Adivasis, and how nation or the particular idea of nation is being privileged over and above democracy and the constitution, which is indeed happening. And I would tend to agree with you that in Indian context, there's less reason for optimism. And of course, what Mr. David was mentioning was optimism in the context of US and seeing that almost sort of revolution, protests in 2,000 cities, as New York Times has brought out, and multiple cities, small towns with white majority. And so that is a very inspiring moment that inspired movement all over the world. Had this not taken place in US, I don't think Europe and other countries movement would have been triggered off in other solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement. With this, I would request Mr. Vinod Mobai, Dr. Vinod Mobai, to have a conversation with Mr. David and Suhas Palshikar, and if something is left out, I also, if I have some question, I'll also, and then after that, we'll open it up to everybody.
Thank you, Irfan. Is the audio okay? Can everyone hear?
Yes, we can hear.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Yeah, nice to see you, David. And I will just start off by asking you to amplify a little bit of the history in the US to give a better idea to our audience, which is mostly in India, that to understand where we are today with the Black Lives Matter, we can recall that the war between the states and the defeat of the slave-owning southern states was over 150 years ago. Then could you briefly tell us what happened in the interim in which a kind of de facto slavery was reestablished and what is called the era of Jim Crow came into being, whose results are still, we are seeing today, right now, as we try to overcome that era. Could you just tell us in a minute or two about that history?
Yes, it's a very good question, and unfortunately something that is not taught widely in this country. So after the Civil War, Black Americans were liberated and by law were regarded as citizens. There was what was known as a period of Reconstruction, where African Americans were involved in government. There were 2,000 Black elected officials throughout the country during Reconstruction, senators, members of the House of Representatives, mayors, governors. And there was a sense that things were on the right track and people were gaining their rights and were empowered. But this soon came to an end because the white Southerners, the white supremacists who had actually lost the Civil War, decided to take all of that away. And as a result, they enacted laws to strip Black people of their rights and essentially revert them to a system of enslavement without it actually being called slavery. And in some cases, Black people were controlling cities, they were running cities and state legislatures. They were assassinated. Their communities were burned down and destroyed, and the white mob came in and took over. So in summary, this is an example of how much progress was being made and so much of it was taken away. And that's how we came to this era of segregation with a system, a codified system of segregation that the German Nazis used as their model, but in some cases they did not follow all of the rules and laws because they thought that they were too extreme.
Yes, thank you for telling us about that. And when we come to where we are today, we had the great civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s and so on that made some progress in overturning the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow. But it seems that the ecosystem of white supremacy, or what has been called racial capitalism, is very deeply embedded in the consciousness of especially the power structure, more in the Republican Party, but certainly not absent in the Democratic Party either. So could you give us some idea of the guarded optimism that you proclaimed, which I share because I've seen some of the marches myself. Could you tell us a little bit about where this guarded optimism, can it go outside the political system as it is currently structured? Will there be a need for some new movement or a new party or a new structure to evolve before its gains could be realized?
Yes, I am cautiously optimistic, primarily because in all the years that I've been an activist and have participated in social movements and studied them, I've never seen anything like this. Just the extent to which people around the country are engaged and mobilized, particularly white Americans. I believe that this is a moment that could potentially become transformative. I believe that it could lead to political change, economic change, and social change. Obviously, the history is being written as we speak, but just to see the cultural change taking place. Just to give you one example, this weekend, the state legislature in Mississippi voted to change their state flag. Their state flag incorporated the Confederate Southern Civil War battle flag, the white supremacist battle flag, as part of their flag. They eliminated that. At Princeton University, they have removed the name of Woodrow Wilson from their buildings, from their schools. Woodrow Wilson, a president of the United States and also a former president of Princeton University, his name was eliminated because he was a white supremacist. So these cultural changes that we're seeing, I think, are very significant. But whether it goes the next step and leads to changes in policy, that is happening, but the extent to which that will actually take place remains to be seen. And I think it depends on continued movement building, not just what's going on at this moment, but also unforeseen movements for racial, economic, and social justice.
Yes, thank you so much, David. I think you've explained to us that cultural change now needs to be strengthened by political change as well, and to what extent and how far and how fast that can come, like changes in exemplified by the defund the police type of movements, how they change the power structure, because we know that the function of the police is to guard power, property, and privilege more than anything else. And that is the function of the state forces of repression in all countries where private property is the rule. So to what extent that can happen? Yes, it is a transformative movement potentially, and let's hope it goes in a direction that fulfills your sense of a cautious optimism. Thank you so much for explaining this to us.
Thank you.
Sorry. I would like to ask two quick questions to you, Mr. David, and then Professor Palshikar. I'm aware that we should open this up for more question and answers as well. The two quick questions are as follows. Disbanding the police, that was idea unthinkable in India. There's so much of veneration of security forces in India that a Muslim or a Dalit may so much as even touch a police officer or constable, and the entire society will, of course, they can beat up the police officers, and there have been such incidences. But disbanding is unthinkable in India. Uh, I mean, it was an idea that I heard of for the first time. And so, could you explain? I mean, if the police is disbanded, what are they replaced by, or what does that policy implication mean? That's one. Very quickly, and second, I sometimes find that people from Asian background also feel themselves superior to, in my some recent visit to US and uh, at other times as well. I felt that people from Asian communities feel that they are better off than, they share the same prejudices that white people have about black. And I had a tough time countering them with some of the people I know and have those prejudices. So there is sort of this graded inequality, even perhaps in US. Two quick questions.
Yes, as far as disbanding or dismantling the police, I think it means different things for different people. For one, there's a growing consensus that the police, that law enforcement cannot exist as it is. So some people believe that resources have to be taken away from law enforcement and placed into social welfare programs. The police are involved in issues and matters that they should not be involved in. Mental health, people with mental health challenges, other non-violent, non-criminal issues that the police are called upon to resolve. So I think that what, in general, what people are calling for is reimagining what the police should do or what they should be. Some people believe police should be eliminated altogether. Others believe they should have a smaller role. But it is for certain that the way it stands now, it cannot remain. To your second question, there is a lot of colorism among various people of color in the US, so that some members of the Asian community, some members of the Latinx community may feel superior or different from African Americans, even as some of them may actually be dark skinned or even black. I think some of that reflects the role of white supremacy in this country and how people are told, particularly some immigrants, it's reinforced that being closer to whiteness is desirable. And being African American, being a descendant of slaves, is the furthest thing that you want to be associated with. And that's reinforced in the culture. And I think that's what you're seeing. And even within the Black community, there is colorism and a sense that among some people that those with lighter skin are somehow better than others, or with a straighter hair texture and things of that nature.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. David. One question to Professor Palshikar. I would like to recall here, you rightly said, and I tend to agree with you, that generally building solidarity across victim groups in India doesn't seem to be possible because of this graded inequalities or the fragmented communities that you are talking about. Yet I'm just wondering that during Kathua rape case, there were protests like what we see in US, maybe on a lesser scale, but they were very widespread. Every small town I would go in, uh, and I would find some slogans against the perpetrators of Kathua, victim of that Kathua rape case, Asifa. Somewhere some slogans written, some demonstrations happened very widely. The other thing that generated, at least in Mumbai and Delhi, was the Delhi rape case in 2013. There was that empathy, which we see missing now. The third thing that has mobilized people across communities and caste and regions is corruption. The JP movement for total revolution was one such movement where people of different communities came together. Would you like to comment on this, that on certain issues there is empathy, people are crossing over and building solidarities and solidarity movements? Asifa was a Muslim.
I think there are two things, but before I turn to them, let me say that corruption doesn't actually scandalize us. I don't think, therefore, that the support that the JP movement got in the 70s was on the question of corruption as such. But let's leave that as a matter of detail. I think one of the good signs of what happened in Delhi in the so-called Nirbhaya case, and what now happened more recently in the Kathua case, is that there is a more blatant violation of human body which applies not only to just one community but to a whole section of society. And therefore I think there was a more concerted response to that, which I believe is a good thing, because if that happens in the case of women, then there is a possibility that could happen in the case of other social sections as well. The question is that it is not building. That is the point that I'm making, that it is not building up. And unless it builds up, not just on gender question, but also on the question of minorities or the castes, I don't think that this sentiment of being together and valuing the other person as a person would be consolidated. That's the limited point I'm making.
No, I entirely agree with you that it is in India. It is more difficult to build a movement across, and particularly against oppression of Muslims or Dalits. Dalits are in day-to-day lives in the villages, the way they are brutalized, and yet there is no empathy. That's because of this religious sanction of this oppression. Unlike US, where you don't have a religious sanction for oppression of African Americans or people of, I mean, at least in churches, there are black churches. At least everybody is welcome in the church. Nobody is excluded from the church. Anyway, thank you for those comments and answers. I would now like to open up the discussion for everybody. We are going to continue this till 8:30, half an hour more, and people can ask questions in the chat box. I've seen some questions in the chat box. I would request Suraj to read them out, and if you have indicated to whom your question is directed, accordingly, either Mr. David or Mr. Professor Suhas Palshikar can reply, or both of you can reply to any question if you so feel like that. So,
yeah. Yeah, thank you, sir. There's one question which is directed to Suhas Palshikar, which is from Etsy, and something similar what Zainab has also told, which is this anti-CAA movements is trying to build a coalition of minorities, including the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So, and her question is, due to this pandemic, the government is able to suppress it. So is it possible post-pandemic that this whole building up of coalition of minorities could threaten or could challenge the government?
What happens is that the pandemic and therefore post-pandemic public life is going going to be so different that probably, as I said early on in March itself, April itself, that the public issues before the pandemic are probably going to be drowned. It would require a very high level of skill on the part of the anti-CAA activists to actually keep the momentum, come back, and also connect it with the questions that the pandemic has thrown up. That's something, that's a huge kind of expectation. But that's the only way. Otherwise, I see that the pandemic would bring new issues, the pandemic would bring new victims, the pandemic would bring new language of politics.
Okay. There's one more, in fact, more than one, which is from Subodh Bedre. He has two questions. Sorry, one question which is directed to David. The first question is, he believes that US is practically the only major nation which still elects its judges and prosecutors. Is this not an is it not an impediment in the pursuit of justice? Does not this move or less ensure the prevalence of the majoritarian views? The second question to Mr. David is, why is it that some prominent Black personalities like Michael Jackson and Beyonce, to name a couple, went in for skin lightening procedures? What message does this send to an average Black teenager?
Very good questions. Uh, as to the first one, yes, I believe that the election of judges and prosecutors has a corrupting influence on the implementation of justice in the United States. Not all judges are elected, some are appointed, but it's a situation that is just setting itself up for corruption and conflict of interest, particularly when people who are running for these positions seek campaign contributions, financial contributions from people. And politicians tend to make decisions based on who is providing money to them. However, I would say that it is very encouraging that even within the system of the election of prosecutors, we're seeing some change now. For example, here in Philadelphia, where I live, we have a progressive, reform-minded prosecutor, a district attorney, who was formerly a civil rights lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer, who had support from the Black Lives Matter movement. And he has come in and it has led to sweeping changes in the way justice is served in this city. So I think that there is some room for change. As far as judges, right now, unfortunately, we're seeing more conservative judges that are being placed on the bench, and that's something that should concern everyone. To your second question, I think this is the age-old issue of self-hatred, and also the imposition of Western European standards of beauty. But I believe that nowadays, with this political and cultural movement, you are also seeing a lot more self-love on the part of people of color, and embracing of their heritage. And I believe that that will only continue.
Okay, there's one more question from Deen Bandhu Manchala. His question is, white privilege and racism in the US and caste privilege and casteism in India based on defective anthropologies which sustain large systemic human rights violation in the world. Black Matters uh, and Dalit movements are on a historical struggle. How can we stay focused on these two struggles and stay in solidarity with the Black and Dalits against the two evils of racism and casteism? Professor David.
Yes, I think it's important that everyone realizes that their struggles are the same. Racism, it's interesting how in the US we have a color-based racism. In India, you have a caste-based racism, which obviously has some skin color undertones, but ultimately racism is based on perceived differences. So people here in the US, people who are the victims of racial discrimination and their allies, structural racism, have to realize that their fate is connected to the Dalits in India and other minority groups who are being discriminated against. It's even though some of the circumstances might be different, some of the fine points, some of the details, the historical circumstances may be different. Ultimately, it comes down to the same thing. And if one of us is not free, then none of us are free.
Thank you, Professor David. There's one question which is directed to Suhas sir, which is, how can we understand the relationship between pandemic and populism in the Indian context?
Well, to wit, the pandemic has sort of muted populism currently. But populism is a deep-rooted political tendency. And therefore, I guess that in spite of pandemic, populism would resurface, because populism is not just about the popularity of one particular leader. It is also a belief that there is no mediating factor and it is just the people who matter. Populism in principle, therefore, is opposed to the idea of procedures, whereas lives matter, whether of the blacks or the Dalits or the Muslims, is a movement which believes in fair procedures. To the extent, therefore, that one is talking of fair procedures, pandemic or no pandemic, populism will keep resurfacing, because populism will always find a challenge in procedures. There is a juxtaposition between fair procedures and populism. Once we start insisting on fair procedures, the responses are bound to be populist responses, because politically they have been rather paying dividends. So I guess in India, within next 1 year or so, populism would be alive and kicking once again.
Suraj, if you allow me to ask a question which is posed on Facebook.
Yeah, sure.
So there is a question to Mr. David from Nasreen Fazal Boy, who is on Facebook. She has asked that the Black women in the Black Lives Matter movement have played an active role, as they did in the past in 1920s as activists. The question is, where is this heritage evoked today and used at present?
The Black women are at the heart of this movement. They were always at the heart of racial justice movements in the US. Many times they didn't receive their just due, but they are in the leadership of this movement. And I think that is a very good thing, and I think it's very important. And also, often what is left out of the equation is that Black women are also victimized by racial injustice through police abuse through various policies that affect Black women. So I think that it's a very good thing that Black women are leading this effort, and they need the support that's necessary for them to live their lives.
Thank you.
Okay, so
Suraj,
yes, sir.
also read out the names of
Yeah,
person who has asked the question.
yeah. So
The
this
previous
question,
question was asked by Indra Munshi.
okay. The next question is from Leila Kadiwal. Her question is actually open to all of the panel speakers. How do we generate an intersectional understanding that people are discriminated based on their caste, class, gender, religion, color, regional locations, and sexual preferences? None of us are free if even one of us is unfree. Yeah, it's open to speakers. Anyone can answer that question.
Can you repeat?
The threat to justice everywhere. Yeah. Oh, please go ahead.
No, I was asking, can you just quickly repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, how do we generate an intersectional understanding that people are discriminated based on all the differences, caste, gender, religion, sexual preferences? None of us are free if even one of us is unfree.
You know, if David doesn't mind, I would just respond first, right? See, as a principle, this is a fantastic proposition, and that is how one should approach theoretically. But at the same time, political struggles are not based only on ideas that operate in theory, and therefore it is the victims who have to agitate, who have to protest, who have to come out, and it is the victimhood of each section of the society's victims that has to be defined. Only then broader linkages are possible. So the first step to my mind is the protest by those who suffer. The next step would be the alignment of those who don't suffer. The third step probably would be to intellectually or conceptually understand that finally all these struggles have something in common. So that's a long journey, really. David.
Yes, I think that it's important for people to connect the dots. And as they look at their own personal struggles, they have to ask who is benefiting from all this oppression. So I think that now in the US, various groups are beginning to connect the dots, because right now we're not just talking about police abuse and racial injustice, but we're also talking about economic inequality. And the fact is that this country has always had many poor white people. There have been examples of poor whites and poor blacks banding together to work for a common effort. Those efforts have always been thwarted, and who benefits from those efforts, of course, have been wealthy white people. So it's important for people to see how their oppression is connected to the oppression of other people who perhaps don't look like them, but they should learn that they have far more in common than the things that separate them.
Any more questions, Suraj? I think Suraj has gone mute. Hey, if I can see the questions I'll ask. This.
Irfan, you had asked earlier about the Indian community in the US that generally looks down on the minorities here, especially the Black community. They identify more with the white power structure. And you saw this at the Howdy Modi kind of events that, that took place when you were, in Texas and so forth, and the Indian community is cheering Trump and his cohorts and so on. I think that, this depends on the two cleavages, which are race and class in society. The Indian community in the US is generally high income professionals and businessmen, etc. And they instinctively identify with the higher economic classes, which are largely the white power structure and Wall Street and so on, as a economic success. And generally the Blacks, the Latinos, etc., are at the lower economic class. So they don't feel any generally sympathy or identification with them. I think it's a matter of class more than anything else. For the record, it's a different situation in Canada, where a lot of the Indian community came in as working class. And you find some of that reflected in Canadian politics. You're not going to find, here you have the Hindus for Trump phenomena in the US. I don't think you'll find Hindus for the, right-wing Canadian political movements existing there, because it has to do with the class origin of the majority of the immigrant group. And I think that sort of explains the question you asked.
Yeah, okay. There's one question from Shakti Raj. It's in Hindi. I'll read out and maybe I'll also translate for Mr. David. नमस्कार सर, एक जिज्ञासा है, एक अश्वेत व्यक्ति को मारने के चलते जिस तरह से यूएस में एकता का और सामाजिक न्याय का रूप देखने को मिला, उसी प्रकार का उग्र रूप भारतीय परिप्रेक्ष्य में देखने क्यों नहीं मिलता? This is asked by Shaktiraj. Actually, I think it is more to Professor Palshikar, but I'll translate it for the information of Mr. David. Mr. Shaktiraj is asking that why don't we see the movement on the lines that we see in US, that all people from white race also coming out on streets and opposing George Floyd's atrocities on George Floyd and black people. Why don't we see a similar movement in India? So I think Professor Palshikar has answered, but if you want to say something, Professor Palshikar?
No, I don't think I would add anything to what I said, that in the first place, we fail to stick to principles. In the second place, we fail to understand that there are links in the victimhood of one and the victim of other. And in the third place, we are not ready actually to struggle and protest against authority.
Correct. Okay. Mr. S. Sen asks to David Lau, in 1968, Western Europe had seen a mighty wave of students' movement that for quite a while appeared to be earth-shaking. But with benefit of hindsight, it can perhaps be deemed to have failed to cause any lasting change. How the Black Lives Matter is expected to be different?
Well, we really don't know if it will be different. It depends on whether people continue the struggle. I believe that in this country, in the US, for many years, there was a sense among some Black people that the civil rights struggles were over and we had arrived and there was no more racism. And surely they have been proven to be wrong. I would also say that we should take a look at the efforts from the ruling class, from corporations, from the political elites. Take a look at the efforts that they will make to somehow infiltrate these movements, to somehow try to shape these movements to their liking. It will be interesting to see whether these movements will be able to withstand pressures to compromise and somehow change their message. But that I think is a reality, and people will have to be vigilant to make sure that that doesn't happen.
There is a question from Mr. Arun Doras. Whether the judgment of Savarna judges, that is upper caste judges, in case of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe violates the principles of jurisprudence. I think Professor Palshikar could take this.
I am not sure whether we should be always looking into the sociological roots of the actors and impute motives or conclusions to them. There have been cases where this might have seemed to be very odd, but there have also been cases where, for example, a judge belonging to the same community or caste of the accused might as well be himself or herself such a part of the system that the judge will still give punishment unnecessarily to the victim. And therefore, I think this is much more complicated than merely making an equation between the caste community of a judge and the caste community of a party to the ruling or party to the case. You know?
Laila Kadiwal again asks another question. Hindus for Trump are also a very wealthy group. Alt-rights Hindus from South Africa, East Africa and India based for generations in the USA and the UK. So I think, sorry, this is more of an observation.
There is one question from Facebook, if I'm allowed to raise it.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jyoti Punwani has raised a question on Facebook and it's directed to Professor Suhas Palshikar. She is asking for how long will the Muslims be blamed for partition of India?
I think so long as it pays politically, it would continue because this is a blame game. It's not rooted in facts, it is rooted in redefinition of facts. As we find that narrative that Muslims are responsible for a certain historical fact, or Muslims are for that matter responsible for many other contemporary problems, will actually serve political purpose. And that is why I said that we don't need to only blame the existing regime. We also need to take into account these deep-rooted social prejudices against community A by community B. Unless this game of stereotyping the community is understood, we probably wouldn't go much farther.
There's an observation by Dinbandhu Banchala. I hope all Indians join to dismantle caste, like the way they are trying to do in US. I believe Dinbandhu Banchala also wrote an article on this and gave numerous suggestions as to what we should do, and everybody would agree with this. Are there any other questions? Why there is no adequate representation of SC/ST judges in the Supreme Court or High Courts? Again, I don't think anybody from here can answer. there is also Flavia has an observation, particularly uh, on the question that I posed. She disagrees that I'm trying to locate that question. I want to read her words. Just a minute. I disagree with Flavia Agnes observes, I disagree with Irfan's analysis about the Nirbhaya case. Don't forget that it happened in Delhi and she was not a Dalit. The gruesome rape of Dalits seldom raise these type of protests. I entirely agree with Flavia. I was asking in a different context. Yes, upper caste women's rapes are politicized or triggers of movements. Uh, Dalit women face humiliation in villages in their day-to-day life, including rapes, several rapes, and they don't trigger off this kind of movement. I agree with you, Flavia, entirely. I could just agree with you entirely. I was asking in another context that trying to locate George Floyd moments in India. We can say that operation of Dalits does not trigger off George Floyd moments in India. Yeah. Yes, entirely agree with you, Flavia. Is there any other question that I'm missing?
No, I guess.
Okay. So I think we finished exactly on 8:30 and all the participants were quite cooperative.
No, the idea of not allowing participants to ask questions live has probably discouraged many. You have to type it down, you know.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, which is directed to Suhas Palshikar. Professor Christoph does mentions about ethnic democracy, and he kind of, I guess, hints that comparing Israel, that are we moving towards India moving towards an ethnic democracy where, within the structures on the basis of ethnicity, some are favored by law.
Yes, I would say that broadly I agree. The only difference between the two of us would be terminology. I have been using the term religious majoritarianism for last 15 years for the simple reason that I don't understand this word ethnicity at all. And therefore I have avoided using it. Political scientist, and I am also a political science student, but political scientists are enamored by the term ethnicity, which is simply because I think that is more fashionable to use it in North Atlantic context. It doesn't make sense to me, and therefore I don't use it. But otherwise, yes, substantially I agree with Christoph.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Suhas.
We could request Neha to give vote of thanks.
Yes, I'm here. Well, there are a lot of viewers on Facebook right now, and there are a lot of participants here. And there are comments which I would like to resonate, that it has been a very stimulating and informative evening. Both the speakers have actually brought out so many important issues. David Love, of course, has taken us through some historical perspective as well, and contemporary protest and the measures taken in US. And similarly, Suhas Palshikar has so beautifully drawn parallels in India of discrimination and microaggressions, as David Love said. I think it has been very important because it has brought out the question of how to forge these victim communities, unity amongst them, or if not unity, at least solidarity. And this is something we all will take back with us and be active in such movements. I would really like to thank both the speakers who have agreed and managed with the time difference in the two countries. So thank you to both speakers. Vinod Mobai, who has graciously actually contacted and brought together this whole talk. Thank you, Vinod Mobai. It has been very, very timely. And thank you to the moderator. And most importantly, thank you to the viewers and to the participants on Zoom, because it's been late, but everyone has really enriched this discussion by bringing in very important questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So, thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. David. Thank you, Professor Palshikar, and Vinod Uncle for bringing, contacting Mr. David and ensuring that he's there. He was very cooperative. Both the speakers were very cooperative, very easily agreed. And from bottom of my heart and from CSS, I would like to thank all of you. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, David. Yeah,
Bye,
thank
David.
you. Okay. Bye.
मी नाही चालू केली आहे. मी फक्त